During the Second World War, many brave individuals joined partisan or resistance movements against Axis occupiers. The subject of today's video is one that you might consider an unlikely leader of a resistance group fighting against Imperial Japanese soldiers in the Philippines. A female schoolteacher by the name of Fernandez sought to defend her home and her students from the Japanese occupiers, earning herself a fierce reputation. It is perhaps helpful to start with the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. The Philippines were an American commonwealth with a number of American naval bases. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan launched surprise attacks on American bases. The goal was to limit the reach of the Allied forces by denying them access to the Philippines whilst allowing Japan to expand into Guam and the Dutch East Indies. The Filipino and American defenders were captured, many forced on the horrific Bataan death marches where over 10,000 Filipino soldiers were killed. For Nieves, living on the island of Leyte, her life as a schoolteacher would be turned upside down by the Japanese invasion. One of the dangers for civilians was abduction or coercion into becoming a comfort girl for the Japanese military. Comfort girls was a euphemism. Essentially, women and girls were forced into prostitution and subjected to repeat assaults in army-run brothels. We do have a video on this topic if you wish to look into it further. But many of these comfort women were killed by their captors or shunned by their families, a fate that befell many women and girls. Nieves was chiefly concerned about the fate of her students, particularly with that of her female students. She had witnessed the tortures employed against civilians, including numerous forms of water torture. One involved the victim being placed in scalding hot baths, then placed into some freezing cold bath, alternating until they obtained what they wanted. Water tortures where the victim was filled with water through a hose until their stomachs swelled, only for them to be jumped on. She witnessed how the Japanese used such methods not only to extract information, but to also steal from the local population. In the face of the occupation, Nieves took up arms against the Japanese, seeing it as not only a duty to her country, but to the students she served. She opted to start a resistance movement, killing and assassinating Japanese soldiers. Her method of killing would usually be with a bolo knife, a common tool for clearing dense jungle and a deadly weapon. She would forego wearing shoes as to walk silently and stalk her prey in the forests. She was known to wear a simple black dress, as if she was the embodiment of death itself. She would sneak behind the soldier and stab them below the ear. This would usually be enough to render the victim unconscious, if not dead. In order to ensure of the kill and to make sure the soldier would not scream out, she would follow the stab with a twist. The other method in which she killed can be seen in this photograph on screen now, where she is demonstrating her technique to an American soldier named Andrew. Here she grabs the soldier's hair and is about to demonstrate the cut which slices the artery and internal jugular, both of which lead to the brain, and the slashing of which leads to a quick death. She would teach this method to other resistance fighters, eventually leading a band of over 100 men. She became known as Captain, in large part due to her ability to lead and her capacity for killing. In addition to using bolo knives, the group would build makeshift grenades and shotguns. The grenades would often be simple explosives in a case filled with nails. The firearms, known as lotongs, would be homemade pipe shotguns that too would fire nails. In addition, Nieves would steal weapons from the Japanese soldiers. She was noted for being an excellent marksman. During the war, she killed around 200 Japanese soldiers. Her infamy was such that Japanese authorities offered a bounty of 10,000 pesos. This reward would never be claimed. While some did attempt to claim the bounty, she evaded capture and serious injury during the war. The only real harm she encountered was a bullet to the arm and a scar to her forehead. Nieves was but one of some 250,000 resistance fighters operating in East Asia. Whilst taking the fight to the Japanese, they also provided intelligence to the Allied forces and prepared the way for the eventual Allied recapture. All of this was often achieved with little in the way of supplies, save for what they could scavenge and steal. For many of the unknown, uncelebrated resistance fighters, we have little information as to their lives and exploits save for the stories passed down. But for Nieves, there is a single news article detailing her activities during the war. In November of 1944, Nieves gave an interview to the Lewiston Daily Sun newspaper. As part of recounting the progress of the war, her story was published. The few lines of the paper detail her activities, a short story on a page filled with news on the progress of the war. But after this, it is not entirely clear as to her fate. It is not clear how long she lived, whether she continued to teach, or how her experiences of the war impacted her life. She was remembered and her story was told by her community and family. It is thought that she may have lived well into her 90s, living with her children and grandchildren. This is true for so many stories of individuals throughout history. Individual examples of bravery and remarkable action are so often footnotes to the largest narrative. For Nieves, her story remained oral. As a quick aside, our grandfather would often tell us stories when we were younger, a major influence for our love of history. We assisted him in writing down the stories he was told by his father, who served in the Second World War, as well as his own childhood during the war and his experiences. Such accounts are valuable not only for a family to understand their own history, but for all of us to appreciate our collective history. Nieves was not alone in being a female resistance leader in the Philippines. Another notable example is Remedios Ginto Gomez Paraiso. She was born in 1919 and spent her teenage years competing in beauty pageants and making her own dresses. Her father, Basilio Gomez, was the mayor of Mexico, a municipality of the Pampanga province. Her father organized resistance against the Japanese invaders, but was ultimately captured. He was subjected to torture and then executed. His mutilated body was made into a public spectacle as a warning to others who might wish to take up arms. For Remedios, this only pushed her to fight back against the Japanese. She joined the People's Army against Japan, a communist guerrilla force who attracted many wishing to fight against the Japanese. At its height, some 9,000 guerrilla fighters were operating. Joining with her brother Oscar, she learned the ways of the guerrilla fighter, where she was noted for her dedication and skills. After only a few months, she was placed in command of her own unit, earning the nickname Commander Liwayway. Noted for wearing striking red lipstick and a formal dress in combat, she was quoted as saying her reasons for dressing in such a way. The first reason was to present herself as fearless to her men, and the second was, quote, fighting for the right to be herself. Her primary role was the stealing of food, material, and weapons from the Japanese, often engaging them in combat. At one point, her forces rescued a downed American pilot named Bob Tanner, who remained with the group fighting alongside until he returned to the Americans. The two remained in contact after the war. At the Battle of Camansi, she ignored orders to retreat, instead encouraging the 100 or so men under her command to cause the Japanese to retreat. Such was her infamy that she could liberate villages of Japanese forces by merely arriving with a machine gun, dressed to the nines. She would issue a warning that her men were nearby, and this would be enough to cause soldiers to retreat. Her forces played a role alongside the American forces in the liberation of Luzon. Before the end of the war, she reportedly tracked down the Japanese officer who ordered the treatment and killing of her father, carrying out the same punishment onto him. Remedios survived the war, went on to marry and lived a long life, dying in 2014. The stories of Nieves and Remedios are but two of millions for those caught up in the horrors of World War II. These individual stories make up the wider narrative of the war, so often overshadowed by the grandeur of other significant figures. These more personal stories of everyday people thrust into the horrors of war speak to us in ways that perhaps are easier for us to understand. It is hard to understand for most what it takes to lead a country into war. But whether one has the bravery to fight against an invading force is a question that these stories naturally invite. Few can honestly say that they would have acted in the same way as these two women, and therefore, their stories deserve to be remembered.